Hello and welcome to our Week 4 supplemental lecture on David Bloor's The Strong Program in the Sociology of Knowledge. We're reading one chapter out of a fairly short text. If you're thinking about writing an essay on this issue, it wouldn't be that hard to take a look at the rest of the text. But it is a kind of manifesto, and it's a manifesto that's been important for a lot of different strands of critical studies of science and technology that have taken place since the 70s, when this text was originally published. In this text, what Bloor is going to do is he's going to set out the kind of criteria that he thinks are most important for the sociological study of science, and he's also going to try to anticipate what he thinks are going to be the major objections to this project and respond to those. He refers in passing to several of the other texts that were available to read in our other topic this week, so you can take a look at what he's saying about some of the other authors that we're also reading. So Bloor starts off saying there's an odd phenomenon in the sociology of knowledge, which is that it tends to focus on old forms of knowledge rather than contemporary forms. It tends to look at past societies or at elements of contemporary societies that are understood to be non-modern, and it tends to tell a story about past thought as a story of error. He says it's traditionally refused to analyze the content and nature of scientific knowledge, restricting itself to the circumstances surrounding its production. Okay, so it takes a look at various social processes around knowledge production, but not at the actual contents of what we currently believe. And he says this is not a necessary self-restriction. The distinction breaks down, he thinks, when you look at it closely. He says there are no limitations which lie in the absolute or transcendent character of scientific knowledge itself, or in the special nature of rationality, validity, truth, or objectivity. He says you'd expect disciplines ordinarily to try to expand their scope, so even if we start off telling the story of non-modern forms of knowledge, you'd expect us to kind of encroach over time and get to more recent ones. But this hasn't happened. Instead, you get a sociology that restricts itself to what he calls studies of primitive cosmologies. And when it comes to analyzing questions about the nature of knowledge, sociology has basically ceded the ground to philosophy. But he says this isn't necessary, and it's not even something that's implied at the foundations of the discipline. And he talks about Durkheim. He has in mind a different Durkheim than the one that we looked at a couple of weeks ago. This is Durkheim writing a work called The Elementary Forms of the Religious Life. And Durkheim is concerned there with talking about forms of religion as sort of proto-forms of science. And Durkheim is specifically interested in the role of society in shaping fundamental categories of thought and of knowledge. And Bloor is suggesting that there's no particular reason for sociology to have dropped this agenda, and yet it has. So this is his first mystery. What's going on? Why is it that sociology feels like maybe it can say some stuff about, the sort of margins of scientific production, how things get funded or things of that sort, but it will only analyze the content of systems of knowledge that we no longer agree with, that we think are untrue. So we have a sociology of error, but we don't have a sociology about forms of knowledge that we still ourselves accept. So he says, what are you doing if you're a sociologist and you're looking at knowledge? Well, you're analyzing it, he says, purely as a natural phenomenon. Okay, and for him, a natural phenomenon means something where we can talk about it as the product of specific identifiable causes. That's what he means by natural phenomenon. Knowledge is beliefs that men confidently hold to and live by. So they're taken for granted, they're expressed in institutions, they're invested with authority, and they're collective rather than individual. So he's not interested in sort of individual, idiosyncratic beliefs that occasional people may be quite confident in. He's interested in the things that are supported and have the authority and the endorsement of major social or cultural institutions. And he says this is actually quite distinct from both the everyday notion of what's true and the philosophical notion that knowledge is justified true belief. Okay, so for a sociologist, the initial question of what is knowledge doesn't have to involve a judgment about whether the knowledge is right. something is knowledge for sociological purposes if it is sufficiently believed, if people have enough confidence in it collectively. So you can be agnostic about the truth or falseness of knowledge. And then he says, and this is a theme that we've been talking about over the course of the last several weeks, there is a recognition that knowledge is historically variable. The systems of belief that people have had great confidence in aren't the same over time and are not necessarily the same from one society to the next. And he says, such a variation forms the starting point for the sociology of knowledge and constitutes its main problem. What are the causes of this variation, and how and why does it change? Okay, so this confrontation with the idea that the way that we believe is not the way that people have always believed. The things that we have confidence in are different from the things that people in other historical periods have had confidence in. Why did this change? Why has this happened? Why is this variability in knowledge within different societies possible? And he says sociology is interested in the distribution of belief, in influences on it, in how knowledge is transmitted, in how knowledge is created and maintained, how it is organized and categorized. So all of these things fall within the purview of the sociology of knowledge. And specifically, it's interested in causes, especially if there are any regular patterns or general causes that can let us to say something about how knowledge is produced across different societies or widely within a particular society. He says, if these theories are to satisfy the requirements of maximum generality, they will have to apply to both true and false beliefs. And as far as possible, the same type of explanation will have to apply in both cases. The aim of physiology is to explain the organism in health and disease. Similarly, the sociologist seeks theories which explain the beliefs which are in fact found, regardless of how the investigator evaluates them. Now, this is the red rag for this form of theory. This is the thing that makes people angry. Frequently there is a notion that there's a fundamental difference in kind between an accurate belief, between something that we regard as true and something that we regard as false. And this form of sociology is saying, sure, you can make these distinctions, but what produces the beliefs in the first place probably can't be explained by the truth or falsity of the beliefs themselves. Something makes people believe in things, or a collection of things make people believe in things. And then we have to assess separately whether what they're believing in is accurate or not. But we're interested in the formation of those beliefs themselves. This strikes many critics as a relativist, and in fact later in this book, in a passage that we're not reading for this course, Bloor will explicitly use that term. He's not uncomfortable being described as a relativist. He'll describe himself as such. There are other people who take inspiration from this text that don't think that's an appropriate word to use for what they're doing. But certainly he thinks that there's a way that you can bracket the issue of truth or falsehood. Otherwise you're treating truth itself as a causal force, as though if things are true, their truth is causing people to believe them, but if they're false, some other strange thing, some arbitrary social convention is causing people to believe them. He doesn't find that plausible, not least because things that we regard as true emerge in different times, in different places. If truth itself were a cause, why is it that it takes so long to discover certain kinds of truths? Okay, so he's suggesting that we consider the possibility that the causes of what people believe are something that can be analyzed separately from a distinct system of analyzing whether we hold those beliefs to be true. And then he outlines what he calls the strong program. Okay, so the weak program in the sociology of knowledge is being happy to do the sociology of errors. Okay, accepting the fact that errors have social causes, but not treating truths in the same way. The strong program is going to try to analyze both of these things through the same analytic mechanisms. And he says that it expresses 4 values, which he thinks make it more aligned with the values of the natural sciences than the way that the sociology of knowledge has traditionally been conducted. First, he says that it emphasizes causality. It's concerned with the conditions which bring about beliefs or states of knowledge, whether these are social causes or natural causes. It is impartial. meaning that it is interested in what gets people to believe, in what gets people to accept certain things as knowledge, whether the sociologist themselves regards those views as true or not. So the sociologist can be impartial about what they're studying. They don't have to judge whether it's true. To the extent that they have those judgments, they shouldn't be allowed to impinge on the analysis. It should be symmetrical, he says, and by that he means that it applies the same sorts of analysis to figuring out why people believe true things as it does to figuring out why they believe false things. So there's a rejection here of the notion that truth per se is a causal factor. And it's reflexive. It applies its analytical tools to itself, so it does not accept itself, the strong program, from the same sorts of analysis. If the strong program becomes something that is intuitive for sociologists to start doing now, there's some cause. There's some reason that that's happening. And that reason can't be taken to be that it's just true. Okay, so it needs to reflexively apply to itself the same forms of analysis that it applies to other systems of thought. Okay, and then he says he expects criticisms of the program, and he's going to run through what he takes the major ones to be. So the first objection, he says, has to do with the autonomy of knowledge, and he'll eventually refer to it and then keep referring to it as a teleological view of history. Depending on what you read in previous weeks, you may have heard me defining teleology before. Teleology is related to a notion that history has a goal, and that the realization of that goal is its own driving sort of causal force. And so the idea that you'd have a teleological view of knowledge would be that there is a truth that is out there, that is an endpoint toward which knowledge tends, and that truth itself is an independent causal force in history, that you can divert from the truth due to various sort of external factors, but that it itself is sort of unrolling, developing out of itself over time. And a teleological view with reference to knowledge, he says, is equivalent to thinking that sort of nature has a moral purpose, that nature itself is driving us to recognize it fully and accurately in some way. So in outlining this objection, he says, look, there's a sort of prima facie, there's a superficial plausibility to this, the idea that there may be some reason that if people are saying true things, they have grounds to say them that are different from the grounds that they would have if they were saying false things. Okay, he said, you may object that true, logical, or rational beliefs do not require explanation, only false, illogical, or irrational ones. He says, logic, it may seem, constitutes a set of connections between premises and conclusions, and men's minds can trace out these connections. As long as they are being reasonable, then the connections themselves would seem to provide the best explanation for the beliefs of the reasoner. Like an engine on rails, the rails themselves dictate where it will go. Of course, when men make mistakes in their reasoning, then logic itself is no explanation. A lapse or deviation may be due to interference of a whole variety of factors. Okay, and he says, this position makes successful and conventional intellectual activity appear self-explanatory and self-propelling. It becomes its own explanation. And then sociology or history is welcome to go and look after what he calls the irrational residue. Now, the position he's setting up here is a point that has been made by other theorists. Marx, in particular, in a passage that we haven't read, talks about various conclusions that classical political economy makes, that it presents as logical conclusions. And Marx goes back to Aristotle and shows that Aristotle considers some of the same logical points, but rejects the conclusion that political economy draws. And Marx basically says, look, these guys are not better logicians than Aristotle. They are not brighter than Aristotle. Aristotle is a towering philosophical figure. So if he can't draw the logical conclusion, that may be really good evidence that more is involved in the conclusion than logic itself. Okay, Bloor is setting up for a similar kind of point here. So he says, what can it mean to say that nothing makes people do or believe things which are rational or correct? Why in that case does the behavior take place at all? Okay? Something's got to be causing it. We don't think it's totally unmotivated. What is it that makes people think of drawing certain conclusions at a particular point in time? They don't always draw them. We know things now, we think we know things now, that people haven't always thought. What's going on? Are we just a society with sort of universally less error? Are we brighter people? He says that this approach violates several principles of the strong program. It violates causality. Okay, it only wants a search for causes in relation to error. It violates symmetry. It wants to explain correct and incorrect views better. And it violates impartiality. The researcher has to be in the trenches deciding whether beliefs are true or false before committing to a way of analyzing those beliefs. Now, the fact that this approach violates principles of the strong program doesn't necessarily mean anything unless you accept the principles of the strong program. So he says, look, does the sociology of knowledge need to actually disprove the teleological view before it can get started? Does it have to do that as a kind of first principle? And he says, no, that's not necessary at all. These are two competing ways of looking at the data that we've got available to us. The strong program just needs to be consistent to its own principles, and it needs to do some analysis over time, and we can then look at the results, and we can see if the analysis provided by the strong program gives us better insights than the analysis provided by the teleological view. So he's not going to play the game of saying we have to establish up front which is better. Okay? This is kind of a more Popperian view, at least at this point. He'll criticize Popper in a few minutes, of he's going to toss out a hypothesis, he's going to run with it, and we're going to see what the observations show. We're going to see if there's some things the strong program can explain better. Now, this is a manifesto-style text, so that proof's not going to happen here. He's trying to set a research program. For those of you who read the Kuhn, he's trying to establish a paradigm. But he does say that if you assert teleological and causal views at the same time, so you're both doing the teleological line, and then you're saying, but you're not denying causation, what that boils down to, he says, is arguing that nature itself has a moral impact. So if truth is unfolding over time, and if the unfolding of truth over time itself is what's causing truth to unfold, you're basically saying that nature has a purpose for humankind, and that purpose is to drive us toward a truer understanding of the universe. And he says, look, that's not very consistent with how the other sciences operate. The strong program is more consistent. He says it's not value neutral, it has these specific values that are embraced by the other sciences, which is that nature is disenchanted, it doesn't have a special purpose for humanity. Now, this doesn't mean that the strong program's values are accurate, but it aligns it more with our other sciences than with this the teleological view is able to align. Then a second objection, which he thinks is not as strong an objection, which is simply, sure, I'll accept that true beliefs and false beliefs have causes, but they're not the same cause. They're different causes. Looking for the same cause for the two of them is missing the point. And he says you can see this going all the way back to Bacon, and in fact, if you remember the handout from week 2, we saw some passages where Bacon was talking about different kinds of errors, and they're basically sort of psychological errors, but there's an underlying assertion that our animal capacities, our senses, our capacities for knowledge, if left uninterfered with, will generate true beliefs. It's social artifice that introduces errors and distortions. And again, we've talked about this experience of the period of formation of classical science, the confrontation with difference, with historical variability, with social variability, and the realization that there are radically different beliefs depending on the society into which people were born, which helped to prime understandings of social difference. But there was still a desire for universality, and that desire for universality was directed toward nature and our ability to observe and perceive nature, and it was also directed toward logic. Okay, so this empiricist tradition, Bloor thinks, is quite old, and isn't in conflict with scientific causal accounts. Okay, so unlike teleology, it sort of squares up with what we do in our other sciences. And it suggests that psychology, instead of sociology, is the go-to discipline for understanding true and false beliefs. But he says it's a bit naive to think that our natural faculties, if they're just left alone, will produce truth, so that it's social faculties that produce falsehood. He says, actually our senses and our capacities for reasoning produce a sort of a jumbled mixture of errors and truths, and the mixture varies individually, and it's also subject to social influence. And then he contests whether knowledge is really an individual thing to begin with. He says, the knowledge of a society designates not so much the sensory experience of its individual members, or the sum of what may be called their animal knowledge. It is rather their collective vision or visions of reality. This is the knowledge of our culture as it is represented in our science. It is not knowledge of a reality that any individual can experience and learn for himself. Knowledge then is better equated with culture than experience. Okay, and this is an argument, it comes up in a slightly different way in the Popper from this week, but the idea that we have theories of how things work. We jump to organizing principles that are radically underdetermined by the evidence that we have at our disposal. Okay, so we've got ways of organizing our sense perceptions. And where do those organizing principles come from? Bloor is saying they come from our culture, from our institutions, from our shared beliefs with other people, and that these beliefs are shaped by things that individually we wouldn't even have the capacity to experience. There's too much that goes into those organizational systems. We can't go around and verify it all with our own senses. He says, what we count as scientific knowledge is largely theoretical, but theories and knowledge are not things which are given in our experience. They are what give meaning to our experience by offering a story about what underlies, connects, and accounts for it. This does not mean that theory is unresponsive to experience. It is, but it is not given along with the experience it explains, nor is it uniquely supported by it. Another agency, apart from the physical world, is required to guide and support this component of knowledge. This theoretical component of knowledge is a social component, and it is a necessary part of truth, not a sign of mere error. Okay, now, without the social dimensions to this is an argument that goes back at least to Kant. The idea that sensory impressions are disorganized, they're overwhelming, we'd have no way of making sense of them unless we had some kind of organizational categorization for what we're experiencing. And Bloor is suggesting, following Durkheim, that those organizational systems are fundamentally social in origin. So this provides something for the sociology of knowledge to look at, is the institutional and cultural ways we socialize one another to organize our sense perceptions and to organize our beliefs and knowledge. He comes to a third objection. He's really not impressed by this objection, although he's right that it's one that you'll hear quite a lot. It involves a radical simplification of the claims being made. So this objection runs along the lines of, if beliefs are socially caused, then they'll be in error. The sociologist must understand sociological beliefs to be socially caused as well. Therefore, the sociologist's beliefs, including the belief in social causation, must be wrong, because they are merely causal products of the sociologist's own society and culture. So this is an attempt at making the sort of argument that, if you've listened to some of the lectures last week on Foucault and Habermas, I might have talked about in terms of performative contradiction. This is an attempt to capture the strong program in a performative contradiction. And the contradiction runs, it assumes the strong program shares the assumption that if something is caused, if something is determined by society, it is necessarily in error. And yet, all beliefs are understood to be socially caused. Therefore, all beliefs must be understood to be necessarily in error, including the sociologist's belief that all beliefs are socially caused, and so it eats its own tail. The problem with it, as Bloor is going to point out, is that this assumes that causation is necessarily linked to error, okay, which is a faulty assumption, or at least is not the assumption the strong program is going to be making. So he says this objection relies on one of the previous objections being true. Either the teleological view, which says that any external causation renders beliefs false, or the empiricist view that social causation specifically renders beliefs false. He says the argument takes as its premise the central idea that causation implies error, deviation, or limitation. And again, Bloor is going to say the fact that something is caused, the fact that you can analyze why something came into being at a particular time in particular circumstances, is entirely separate from the question of whether the idea is warranted, okay, whether it is justified as true belief. These are separate forms of analysis. Okay, so the conclusion doesn't follow because the premise isn't right. So it assumes, he says, that sociologists believe that knowledge must be objective in order to be true, that it must somehow sit outside the framework of causation in order to be true, but are accepting themselves from that dynamic by claiming the privilege of objective knowledge for their own positions that they deny to everybody else. And he says these are just inaccurate assumptions. It's not how the argument works. Instead, he says the strong program argues that whether a belief is to be judged true or false has nothing to do with whether it has a cause. And then he brings up a kind of a funny objection, and this one is coming from Popper, not quite the Popper that we read this term. Popper writes a lot on historicism and on the attempt to come up with laws of history. And the argument, as Bloor summarizes it, goes, if we can identify laws that govern social processes, we should be able to predict the future, including future beliefs. But on one level, social complexity makes it really unlikely that we would discover these kinds of laws. But if we were to discover them, then knowledge of the laws themselves would become a new factor in historical causation, which would change the predicted outcome. Okay, so you kind of get an infinite regress. There's a feedback loop that means as soon as you discover laws and people become aware of them, the laws themselves change, and there's sort of constant fluidity. And he says, look, this is not a serious or meaningful objection. In spite of causal regularities that we're able to identify through the natural sciences, the physical world remains pretty unpredictable because we lack knowledge of so many different things. He says the correct conclusion to be drawn for the social sciences is that we are unlikely to make much headway predicting the behavior and beliefs of others unless we know at least as much as they do about their situation. So the sociology of knowledge gives you a kind of a slimline slice that captures some of the regularities in how people behave, but the way that they actually behave in any concrete situation is going to be determined by some combination of that thin slice and all sorts of other complex factors that are going to be very difficult to grasp. Sure, you can try to make predictions, but he says limited knowledge and the vast scope for error will ensure that these predictions will mostly be false. Okay, and then he says, look, Popper's idea that once you introduce your theory, it affects practice in particular ways, making your description inaccurate, is kind of refuted by Popper himself. And here he's referring to the Popper that we've actually read this week. He says, Popper himself sees science as an endless vista of refuted conjectures. So that's his theory, and it is a sociological theory. It's not a scientific theory, not a natural scientific theory. And he says, but publishing that theory hasn't particularly changed anything about how sciences operate. Insight into that dimension of their work is not altered the nature of the work itself. Why would you expect anything different for other claims in the sociology of science? Okay, because Popper is essentially engaging there in a form of sociology of science. Okay. He then says natural sciences look for underlying laws, but when you apply those laws to any given system, he talks about the solar system and the sort of planetary motion. So they're natural laws, universal laws underlying those motions. But the fact that the planets are in the particular configuration they are is kind of contingent. It's the product of a history, and it's a situation that will change over time and could also be disturbed from the outside. Sociology can talk about laws in the same way. And sociological theory involves also the same kind of dialectic, where you do empirical work, you form theories, you criticize the theories with reference to further empirical work, you revise the theories. It's very similar to the process in natural sciences, and so he doesn't regard this as a particularly interesting kind of objection. Okay, so that's Bloor. We'll see some people kicking back on Bloor and people who are inspired by Bloor, particularly when we move into next week. It's the relativism of the position and its perceived threat to truth that makes people nervous.